I'm Justine Burdett, Vice President of Technical Services at The Right Place and Regional Director of the Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center West Office. Thank you all for joining us today. With me are Brian Edwards, Publisher of MiBiz, and Ryan Bonner, Vice President of Customer Success at Brightline Technologies. We are here today to talk about a topic that is in the news constantly these days, cybersecurity. Specifically, we are going to talk about the unique challenges that face manufacturers. Today's webinar is the type of educational program that we enjoy presenting. It is a timely topic in the business world, and we have tried to keep a laser focus on the manufacturing sector. We want MMTC to be a trusted resource that can help West Michigan manufacturers analyze operational challenges. And then we want to connect manufacturers with our network of experts who help them improve their operations. So if you're a manufacturer on today's webinar, I invite you to check out the MMTC West website where you can learn about our area of expertise. Our website is mmtcwest.org. So if you are a service provider on today's webinar, I want you to contact MMTC West as well to learn how our organization serves the manufacturing community. Now I'm going to turn things over to Brian Edwards, Publisher of MiBiz. Brian?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. As some of you know, we had some delays in our original timing on this. We'd like to think that hackers heard we were going to do a presentation about cybersecurity, and they hacked in and prevented us from doing it in a timely fashion. But we're here now. Thank you, Justine, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick rundown of the agenda. Ryan, who's going to join me now, will talk and we'll do some Q&A. We were going to do type messages. I did get some messages from some of you via email, so we'll ask those questions. And this is, as Justine said, this is a really good topic in terms of cybersecurity. It's been in the news a lot. Big ransomware attacks last month. There's been a lot over the past year or so with retail, healthcare, online sites. You think of Target, Ashley Madison, right? There was customer data stolen there. So the perception, though, is that manufacturing is low on the target list, and it's actually moving up the list, as Ryan will talk about a little bit. So we called this the $700,000 manufacturing mistake. There was an IBM study, I think it also quoted Kaspersky Labs, that talked about $700,000 being kind of the cost to recover from a cyber attack on a manufacturing company. So happy to have you here today to talk about all of this. By way of introduction, Ryan Bonner is with Brightline. They are a partner organization with the Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center. They've been working with Michigan companies to help them understand cybersecurity, but also their compliance obligations in their industry, and making sure that they develop plans for achieving that compliance. So Ryan and his team have been working with more and more manufacturers, not just in DoD or defense, where they're very kind of stringent, but also aerospace, automotive, and other industries as well. So, you know, again, Ryan, so the notion here is that manufacturing is kind of going up the charts. It's rising in popularity with hackers.
It is, yes.
So why is that? What's going on there?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors driving that. You know, in the past, hacking was really based on how quickly can I make a quick buck or things like that. And as the cybersecurity defenses of different industries have grown and matured, especially for some of the more targeted industries, like we talked about, like retail or healthcare or some of the big financial institutions, they've become a harder nut to crack. And so hackers, of course, have moved on to industries where the cybersecurity stance is less mature and hasn't been thought through as much, and there's more exposure in the supply chain. So I think what we're seeing a lot of now is manufacturing having not really had as much impetus to really become better at this is simply the easier target for a lot of cyber criminals. Mm-hmm. And it's not to say that there aren't still a lot of dollars to be made in that venture. And so I think what we're seeing is really just a lot of the secondary industries that still represent a lot of the employment base here in the States just being targeted out of opportunity more than anything.
Awesome. Why don't we get to your presentation, and we'll take the webcam off of us here so people can just hear your dulcet tones and also then watch your presentation. So
sounds good.
Let's go here. So that's who we are. Take it away.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been talking about with a lot of our customers is trying to determine how cybercrime is actually going to meet them in their business and potentially create issues or interrupt business operations, make them less effective or profitable, damage relationships. And so for us, you know, we look at what are some of the top manufacturing factors, or as we like to jokingly call them, top manufactors. Excuse the pun.
That's a good pun.
And these are some of the things that aren't really a cybercrime concern at all. These are the things that drive your business. And so for us, you know, obviously manufacturers are worried about cost-effective production. You know, you're going to want to make sure that you can remain competitive from a cost and time schedule perspective. You know, timely delivery is a huge part of that. If you can't deliver things for a set price at a set time, you're not going to remain competitive in the market. We all know that. Internal best practices are also what are going to make your organization good at what they do. That's where your operational efficiencies come into effect. That's where you develop internal processes or manufacturing procedures that allow you to stand out when you're working with customers. And then obviously that all adds up to a solid reputation with your customer base. So when we talk about cybercrime, what I really want to look at is how would cybercrime have an effect on these primary factors? Because at the end of the day, if it's not having an effect on these, we might just be spinning our wheels getting excited about the idea of cybercrime. We can see how cyber attacks, cyber incidents, a lot of the hacking that's going on today in the manufacturing space is affecting these factors. I think it all hits home for all of us. So let's dig into that first factor. We've got this concept of cost-effective production. So that's obviously going to be an attack that's going to come after access to your financial instruments. You know, if you're going to try and be, you know, the organization that has money in the bank and the ability to practice things like lean production or just in time, having cash flow on hand is a huge part of that. So hackers are a lot more often in the manufacturing spaces coming after aspects of your financial transactions that aren't really protected the way they should be. So with an ACH transaction, what's going to happen is a hacker is going to try and sit on your network and exploit your ACH transactions, either in the form of a scam or in a more elaborate hack.
Can I ask about that? Because you know, obviously some of the automotive OEMs pay their, you know, tier 2, tier 3, tier 1 suppliers electronically. How at risk are they?
So the most common cyber attack that we'll see here is actually, it feels more of like a scam than an outright hack. So what'll happen is an attacker is going to get onto your network and they're going to exist as what's called a persistent threat. They're babysitting your network, watching emails in and out, and waiting for the right opportunity. And what they'll do is they will spoof an email address and pretend to be you, or using a compromised account, actually just send a legitimate email telling some supplier or upstream customer who's about to issue a payment towards you, hey, for Friday's payment, send it to this account with this routing information instead. Thanks for that. Have a good day. And then delete that email so you never know that it was sent. Mm-hmm. Well, now the transaction is made, the funds are sent, and they go to the hacker instead of to the intended recipient, your business. It can happen in reverse as well, outgoing money that now you have to pay twice. You used to see this a lot more in other industries, especially in the home mortgage industry. You have a title insurance company that's about to close on a home purchase, and someone intercepts that transaction, encourages them to make the payment a day early than was originally planned, and now you've got $500,000 for a home purchase just gone.
And they're crafty. I mean, we've seen at least one example of somebody sending out, you know, a W-9 form, you know, a letter saying we need your new W-9. Here's, you know, we need your new bank routing information. So it seems all very innocent enough, and it's a spoofed email, I think you called it. So the more and more we try to get payment electronically and moving money electronically, the more at risk we are.
Absolutely, absolutely. So good inside best practices can help with that, but it helps to understand the mechanisms of how that may happen. Payroll can be just as much at risk. We've seen manufacturers who, were doing payroll internally, and a hacker gained access to the system, and the night before payroll went out, changed all of the direct deposit recipient accounts for all of the employees, and you've got, in some cases, 6-digit payroll disbursements that all disappear and go to, those phony accounts, and recovering that can be next to impossible. Mm-hmm. So bank accounts are also at risk, just as far as gaining access to credentials and things like that, locking companies out of their own accounts. And so, you'll see a lot of situations where an executive will have to be specifically targeted, because executives tend to have access to the primary bank accounts for an organization. So if they've got your login credentials and they can intercept even two-factor authentication or something like that, then they could potentially get into a bank account and create an issue there. So that's maybe a little more abstract, than ACH transactions for payments, but those are some of the things that we're seeing out in the real world.
So if you're an executive, you should never let anybody know your first pet's name, or your mother's maiden name, or the street you grew up on. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the other big manufacturing factor we talk about is timely delivery. As a manufacturer, if I can deliver my produced goods out to my customer, as part of an SLA or on a normal agreed upon timeline, then I'm going to have the better reputation with that customer, and I'm going to be more likely recipient of future contract awards. So this is one of the biggest ways that cyber criminals are creating a negative effect for manufacturers, because there's a lot of ways in our age of increased dependence on technology in the manufacturing space that simply interrupting technology is going to interrupt delivery. So a big way that that's going to happen is in the form of denial of service attacks. And so denial of service attacks are really pretty straightforward. Any way that I can interrupt your IT systems from functioning as advertised, I can potentially put you in a bad position and then demand that you either pay for those attacks to stop, or use that as a jumping off point to maybe launch a different type of attack, or simply hold downstream suppliers from an upstream manufacturer hostage and get a payment out of that larger entity. So sometimes you can be targeted, not because of any particular value that you, the manufacturer, hold, but the value that you hold to an upstream customer of yours. And
again, so this is we're all trying to communicate more and more electronically with our customers. There's ERP systems and order systems and other stuff, and so this is just basically interrupting their ability to.
Yeah, and the way that I do that is I just throw a bunch of bad traffic at your network, and then eventually that will just bring everything down. And so it used to be that you had to have a lot of resources available to launch a bunch of bad traffic, enough to completely overwhelm the system. But in today's day and age, where you've got, camera systems and traffic stoplights with computers on them, someone can hack an entire city in Ohio and use the entire city's resources to launch a network attack against you. There's a lot more resources available for that to happen.
And so DDoS attacks were about a year ago. There was, it was kind of in the news, in the media, in the business news, because people were using toasters and stuff. But now this next one, ransomware, this is kind of the topic du jour in terms of the media, mainstream media's coverage of hacking.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about ransomware, specifically with manufacturing.
So if I'm a hacker and I want to come after your business and I want to have the best possible chance of getting money out of the attack, ransomware is it. So ransomware is devious and simple in its nature. When ransomware finds its way onto your network, it simply begins to encrypt data. And once data is encrypted, unless you know the key to decrypt it, it's useless to you. So all of your production data, everything that your systems are built on, are now useless to the organization. And unless you pay the ransom, hence the name ransomware, you can't get that data back. So what we're finding is that hackers who used to build Trojan horse malware or a lot of other types of viruses have almost wholesale moved over to ransomware, because it's so effective at getting money out of users. And with the advent of these new cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, I don't even have to find a way to get paid in US dollars. You know, there's a completely digital way to get money out of a user. So you even see some of the more advanced cyber criminal organizations, they'll have a 1-800 customer number you can call, and they will walk you through how to get set up to provide them with Bitcoin to pay your ransom. So it's pretty amazing what we're seeing out there. And so this is just a quick rundown of how the DDoS attacks will work. You've got generic, normal traffic that normally you'd expect to see, and also you have malicious traffic being thrown at that, and that just overloads systems.
So on this one, the red's the bad. It's just they're throwing tons and tons of traffic at your site to put it down.
Yeah. So our other big manufacturing factor, is internal best practices. I'd say that this is probably the least valued area when it comes to businesses being able to understand this in terms of hacking or cybersecurity threats.
What do you mean least valued?
Well, I think a lot of organizations can draw a line and say someone's trying to steal my money, or someone's trying to interrupt my business. But how about a cyber criminal is trying to put you out of business 5 years from now?
Stealing your IP.
Exactly. And so internal best practices are really what give you competitive advantage in the marketplace. We here in Michigan, we have a lot of investments made into new manufacturing best practices, lean manufacturing, having good quality systems in place. And so those are things that don't exist everywhere globally, not even just looking outside of Michigan, but around the world. There's a lot of organizations or nation states or foreign manufacturers who don't have decades of built-up experience in how to effectively produce high-quality parts using good best practices. So just as valuable as the actual technical data, the plans, or the things like that someone could take from you, they really are also just as interested in the manufacturing processes you use to develop or produce those plans and that data in a high-quality fashion with a low failure rate. And so a lot of organizations aren't really putting this on their radar. So, production methods are going to be a big part of that, and that's ultimately going to lead to overseas reproduction. So, that's how you see a situation where, you've got an F-150 being made here domestically, and if we go overseas, we have something that looks a whole heck of a lot like it.
Oh, wow.
And that's because, overseas reproduction aims to take the original production files that were used to produce that, whether it's CNC machine data or the original plans, specs, and drawings, and sort of piece that together. Now, you can't always do that without knowing the production methods, because sometimes just plans aren't enough.
Sure.
But you add all those together, and you get really close to a completely manufactured process.
So again, it's not just design or parts. It's all the IP related to any product that you're making, whether it's a car or an airplane part or whatever. It's the pricing, it's the bill of material, it's the production methods, it's the drawings, and the supply chain information. Absolutely. The best way that I think that organizations can frame this is anything you wouldn't want your competitor down the street knowing, you can assume that that's going to be a target for cyber criminals. So the last factor is really sort of the culmination of all the other previous factors, and that's our reputation with customers. So, if you're having issues with quality, or having issues with uptime because you're having business interruptions, or you're having issues with cash flow or finances because of a financial hack, that's all going to put you on shakier ground with your upstream customers. Are you financially stable? Those are things that organizations, are mindful of. Why did you have that interruption? Will it happen again? Normally you would meet your timelines, now you're not. Is something changing? Organizations don't always focus on the years of excellent delivery and timelines and quality produced. Sometimes they tend to focus on the instances where that doesn't happen. And if hackers are able to contribute to that happening, then they're putting you on less than ideal terms with your customers. Right. I know and we'll talk about this a little in Q&A because we've got some questions from folks as well as some other questions from our team. Even some of the risk management policies have, if you're hacked, it'll cover the IT and the restoring and all the kind of legal and other issues, but even some of those policies pay for like public relations help, because it's if you get hacked, it's largely going to be about how you respond to it, and so that really gets right to the reputation piece, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's gonna happen to lots of companies, so it's really like so many things in life and in business. It's how you respond to a bad thing happening, and they're willing to include some PR services.
Absolutely. So that if an insurance company has identified that PR services are needed to recover, you better believe they've got some data to back that up. So failed delivery timelines we talked about. Another thing that we haven't talked about is if someone steals your IP and starts producing your parts overseas and then leaking those into the supply chain for your upstream customer, those counterfeit products are most likely going to be associated with your company's quality. And so those are areas where you have to be able to protect against that. Now, we've seen a lot of strides made in a lot of industrial sectors for unique traceability of parts and products as they're produced. So that's good, but depending on where you exist in that supply chain, you may not have a lot of credibility to be able to show that that was the case. So those are things that we always encourage organizations to be mindful of. And then the other thing is this: more often than not, the part that you're going to produce for an upstream customer is going to require some context. You're going to need to know about the assembly it goes into or the overall system it's a part of. And as a result of that, your customer is oftentimes going to share more information with you than is required just for the produced part, but that will contribute to your overall quality. And so when you have an aggregated amount of really important IP and information that belongs to your customer on your networks, and then your network is somehow compromised and that information is taken, that's going to, more often than not, create ill will with an upstream customer if it's found that you're the source of that hack. So an end result that we're seeing in a lot of spaces in manufacturing right now is that customers tend to react and blame the supply chain, and with some good reason in a lot of cases, but sometimes unfairly. It varies. And so what you're going to see is whether or not there's existing regulations in place, you may see those regulations begin to tighten in your industry. You may see individual customers or industry groups or advocacy groups start to co-author new cybersecurity standards they want to see lived out in their supply chain. And so in those types of situations, you no longer get to pick how or when or through what means you secure your networks or provide better security. Now you've got to dance to someone else's drum, as it were, and do things the way that they would like to see things done. And a lot of times what we'll see is that the more broadly written cybersecurity standards that they may ask you to adhere to in order to be part of their supply chain is not always going to be custom tailored just for the type of manufacturer you are. So sometimes you end up having to implement standards that are a bit heavy-handed, let's just put it that way. Mm-hmm. So that's not, and in the long run, in the long term, those standards can be a good thing because a rising tide raises all ships. But it's always better if you can do that on your own terms and have good dialogue with your customers in the process.
Well, again, and I think you'll talk about this in a couple slides here, but so certainly if you're a supplier to the Department of Defense, that's been changing in terms of the requirements, the regulations, the contractual part of it. But in industries like automotive, medical device, office furniture, and I know we have many attendees from those industries that have registered for this, it's very fluid right now in terms of what the regulations are going to be and what the quality or the expectations are going to be from the automotive and other OEMs, correct?
Absolutely. And what you'll see is, a lot of these industry sectors have done a good job of latching onto appropriate quality standards and compliance and regulatory standards for a lot of other areas. What we're starting to see is that now individual areas like automotive or aerospace or medical devices, they are all jumping on board with cybersecurity standards now. And we don't know exactly what all of those are going to look like yet. But
what's your best guess on like automotive? I mean, one of the questions we got is, we've got we work mostly with automotive customers. How much of this stuff even applies to me?
So patently, we're seeing a lot of crosstalk from the AIAG and the automotive manufacturers to the effect that automotive, the big six, let's call it, are really looking heavily at sort of falling into lockstep with a lot of the upcoming government regulations that are already being imposed at a federal level for some of the other types of manufacturing that's being done for GSA schedule contracts or for defense contracts. And so whereas it may not end up being called the exact same thing, we're starting to see the automotive, the big automotive automakers really saying, we really need to have security in our supply chain. We like what we see on the government side. Let's start to synthesize that into what we do here in automotive and take some of those best ideas out of that. So if you want to see where that's going, you need only read about what's happening in aerospace or in defense and just sort of mentally map that onto.
And your best guess is for industries like automotive or medical device, as these things come online, they will be contractual. They won't be regulatory. They'll be contractual between the OEM and the supplier.
Correct. So, you know, the government can always do things in the form of administrative law. The law we all abide by in the private sector is our customers' contractual obligations. So let's go through maybe a good example of how this all might play out using one example that we do have, which is DoD manufacturers. So we talked about in general terms leading up to this, what are some of the ways that hackers might come after you? Well, looking specifically at defense manufacturers, we know what that is. And the target is this sort of proprietary information. So research and development information before major products go into production is always a great target for hackers, especially from other nation states. Also, any plans, drawings, specs, and details you might receive in the course of being asked to quote a particular contract or receiving the contract. There's a lot of great technical data that can be mined there and repurposed. Production processes, this might relate to like mill specs that are attached to a specific manufactured part, or some of your internal production run sheets or things that you know help your team produce effectively. And then of course, you know, the machining and production data. If you're translating a 2D drawing into a complete 3D, you know, CAD file or CAM file for CNC machining or things like that, that is the finished product. You merely need to plug that into, you know, a CNC router or an automated piece of machinery, and you've got the part. So barring some of the quality control and testing procedures on the back end, you've got the real gem there. And so having the preliminary pieces like the drawings and specs to know what that machine piece goes into or what specifications it was designed around can also be really valuable to sort of reverse engineer all of these items. So the result of this is that you've got, in the defense industry, duplicated military designs where other nation states have completely exfiltrated all of that data out of subcontractor and private sector manufacturer systems and are now using that to produce these systems themselves. So a good example of that, you know, you can look at these two planes from a lot of different angles, and I think you might struggle to know which one, if it weren't for the flag next to it, belongs to the United States and which one belongs to China.
There are Russian hackers, is that what you're saying? No, I'm just kidding.
Russian, Chinese, you name it. And so in this case, China has completely exfiltrated and stolen all of the plans for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and can now reproduce that plane without having put any of the money into developing it. So the other example is our current Reaper drone, which is the most commonly used UAV by the US military. The Chinese have not only stolen that particular design, they've, because of the fact that they didn't have to produce it themselves, created 5 new versions of it, designed with all sorts of different capabilities, with better armaments than the US version, with better flight range, with better top speed, all these other things that you know, put us at a security disadvantage, and that's because they just didn't have to put the time into designing it.
I mean, this, you talk about items and topics that are hot in the media. This will be a hot topic, presumably, with President Trump signing the order to pursue how the Chinese are stealing our IP, basically.
Absolutely. This is right at the crux of that. I don't even need to show you this for you to know that the Chinese have taken the design for the Humvee and put it to their own use. So these are some of the examples that you're seeing. So when we look at that, we've got the ability for, let's call this global competitors to, national security, having the ability to rapidly develop countermeasures against U.S. systems or improve upon them. And you're also going to see for us as manufacturers increased regulation and security enforcement from the government in an attempt to stop this from happening. So that's taken the form of, in the defense space, new contract clauses that are in 100% of all new contracts for DoD contractors.
And what is DFARS? Is that?
DFARS is the Defense and Federal Acquisition Regulatory Supplement. It's a set of clauses you'll find in every contract. They used to be just about really banal, boring things like the format of your ledgers for accounting purposes, or how you reported certain distribution statements when you gave your final result back to the government. Now we're starting to see clauses baked in that have to do with your ability to report hacks to the DoD within 72 hours, or large cybersecurity standards for how you secure systems that you own or cloud systems that you operate out of, and how you handle classified data versus unclassified data. So there's a lot of things there. There's new mandated security standards built into a lot of these contracts now. In particular, we're seeing a lot of mandates as a result of the DFAR standard for every defense manufacturer by the end of this year to have an implemented plan to meet this new NIST standard called 800-171. It's a 110 line item security standard that has a lot to say about how you secure your systems. So really, we talked about potentially heavy-handed measures before. We're starting to see a lot of that. And then we're seeing better mechanisms now for the DoD to revoke liability protections given to you as a defense contractor. The old way it used to work is that if you're a critical contractor, because you take on that risk, you get special liability protections. No one can sue you without really well documented proof that you were being malfeasant. Well, now we've got these standards and these clauses that make it really easy to prove when you're not playing ball, which can lead to a loss of liability protections. So we have an exposed backside sort of to our business at this point. And then of course this can lead to loss of business from upstream prime contractors, the big customers that get the big government contracts and then ask defense manufacturers to make this small piece or perform that process. This isn't always their idea either. What we're seeing now is that there's contract clauses that, potentially all of the supply chain for a new contract needs to adhere to a certain security standard. And so when we see that, that's not always up to the prime contractor themselves. So looking at how we try and get our head around this and fix this, I think there's some things that we can do from a defensive perspective and on offense to use this as a jumping off point to grow our business and succeed. So on offense, I think that's going to come together, a couple of different ways. We've got to discover what security practices our customers upstream from us really value, and how do we align ourselves with that? And so what you'll find is that almost every major industry has at least hinted towards some security practices that they like to see in place, or a particular cybersecurity framework or things like that. So I would take those security practices that our upstream customers are valuing, things like encrypting data, or things like having multi-factor authentication when we log into our systems, or certain technologies that they really stand behind because they found that historically those prevent security leaks, and then try and parse those practices into some sort of framework. There's a lot of frameworks out there that you can select, but and they're going to take a lot of different formats, but for the most part, they're going to be things like the IDLE framework, or COBIT, or my personal favorite, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is really flexible and approachable. And for the most part, it helps make sense of a lot of these crazy standards.
I know a lot of our readers are really big fans of the NIST protocols here, but I mean, there's a lot of jargon there. So what, these are, you're talking about protocols that are out there and exist, and
you don't have to write them or invent them from scratch. You probably can already find good case studies of how they were implemented. especially in manufacturing, there's a lot of attention paid to that. So manufacturing and industrial control systems and medical devices all have good white papers written, not only by government agencies, but by third parties who have had good success putting those in place. And those can be a good starting point where you get to borrow, someone else's hundreds of hours of research and use that as your jumping off point.
And this, like a quality standard, would be kind of more of an overarching conceptual kind of approach to things, because, if these are protocols and frameworks that work for, multi-billion-dollar companies, how do we bring it down to the kind of smaller and middle market, kind of manufacturers?
Yeah. I think that there's no magic bullet that's going to make this approachable for some of the smaller manufacturers, but we do have good success stories of where that's happened in working with even really, really small organizations all the way up through several hundred employees or several thousand employees. I think what it comes down to is understanding where sensitive data lives in your organization and on which systems that lives, and really paying the most attention to those. Don't waste your time looking at things where there isn't sensitive data involved, and then really, really understand the business practices that you have, business processes, workflows, everything from email communications to steps taken by your engineering team, how data moves through your production teams and things like that. If you can get a handle on those, you'll figure out really quickly where the biggest risks are for data to potentially be leaked out of the organization or compromised, and you can really focus those attentions there. So for small organizations, you should have a much shorter list of things that need to be looked at or secured and things like that. So scoping really matters.
Right. So we had done a research poll, and it's certainly not scientific. I think we got about 100 respondents. But relative to manufacturers who took this poll, 39% said they had been hacked in the last 2 years. Another 11% said they didn't know if they'd been hacked. And really, when we asked more specifically about what are you most fearful of, 75% ransomware. And
absolutely,
is that because it's in the media? Is that like a realistic, legitimate fear for a manufacturer? 2/3 say customer data exposure. Again, how likely is that in the manufacturing sector versus something like retail or healthcare? ACH fraud, 60% or 59%. We're all afraid of losing our money, and about half, 47%, feared IP theft. I mean, is that a fairly good snapshot of what people should really be worried about?
I think that it's probably pretty accurate. When we look at where the biggest sources of potential problems could come from, the biggest threat is always going to be an insider threat, and that's where somebody either maliciously or just accidentally sends the wrong information to the wrong party. And when that happens, we've got a lot of cleanup to do. And that's usually when the largest amount of overall data accidentally leaves the organization or maliciously is exfiltrated out of the organization. So I think that customer data exposure is a big concern. Ransomware is particularly troublesome for a lot of organizations because of the fact that it only needs to happen once. One person in the organization on one asset needs to make a mistake once, click on the wrong link, enable the wrong macro on an Excel spreadsheet, and ransomware will find its way into everything else in the system and on the network. So I think that's particularly scary for a lot of organizations because we all know that person in the company that might do the
I'm that person in our company, to be honest with you, Ryan. I
Sure.
fat finger the keyboard and missend the occasional email.
Sure. And so good awareness and training can be a big part of that, but it certainly is a concern for a lot of organizations. So I think that a lot of those concerns are well-founded.
So that's kind of the presentation part in terms of your slideshow, but let's talk a little bit about some of the questions that we got. Some people had emailed us some questions. So let's talk about the cost piece, right?
Sure.
Because certainly this adds a cost to the operations, and we'll throw us back on here so we can do a little more conversational.
Yeah.
What kind of cost for a are companies having to invest in just making sure that they're at a basic level, but then even beyond that, what's realistic?
Yeah, I think that when you're looking at most manufacturers, the costs are going to come in a few different forms. You're going to have the monetary costs that we're all mindful of. If we've got to invest in a couple of new security systems or a specialized piece of software, or maybe we've never encrypted our data before and we'd like to start doing that, those all come with a price tag, not only in labor and hardware and software, but there's an organizational technical debt that we take on. And so I think that the biggest costs, if we're going to look at it from that perspective, they come from the organizational costs. Tasking individuals in the organization to undergo new awareness and training, having our operations team have a better handle on their responsibilities, really understanding some of the big risks that exists out there, and having somebody at an executive level own those risks. Mm-hmm. Those all take time and they occupy headspace. Mm-hmm. And so I think that those are going to be where some of the biggest costs come from for a lot of organizations.
And certainly there's an investment. I mean, I think, and those are the soft costs, the hidden costs, but in terms of what should a company be investing in, a small manufacturer, mid-sized manufacturer, at a basic level, and then, beyond that, relative to software, intrusion alert software, or, other mechanisms that are going to help them prevent, and if something happens, alert.
Absolutely. So the current consensus in United States commerce is that on average, an American business spends 3 to 5% of revenues on technology. And that's not just cybersecurity. I mean, that's internet costs. That could be mobile phones. That could be software, computers, printers, all that fun stuff. They could be manufacturing equipment, technology, and some of the IT systems that help back that up. That can be your ERP. I definitely think that making a decision to invest in cybersecurity for the first time could certainly take a 3%er company to a 5% threshold. Adding up to 2% of revenues needing to be spent towards that. The goal is always to back that off and shrink that down through more judicious application of that. But we certainly see that happen. So if that was to be a good litmus test for how much was being spent, I think it's plausible that an organization could be spending up to 2% of revenues on cybersecurity and all of the technologies that go with that. The hope being that it could be less.
I mean, and that's a big number for something that's not going to give you any cost savings or cost reduction.
Yeah,
it's insurance. I mean,
it's definitely a long-term play. There are very few situations where you can say that my cybersecurity practice was a source of revenue.
Well, your firm can say that, and all the consulting.
Yeah. But I think that on some level, if you're looking at the long-term ability to keep relationships or prevent loss of contracts, when I'm talking with government contractors, a multi-year ban on government contracting, while still a black swan event, is still a huge thing to be worried about. Right. And so if I show malfeasance on the cybersecurity side because I've got these contractual clauses, I mean, that's a huge loss to mitigate and prevent against. That's a risk I want to do something about.
Let's talk about risk management. Certainly the insurance companies, the risk management firms have been talking about cybersecurity, pretty actively over the past 2-3 years. Talk a little bit about how kind of their approach to insuring companies against this has evolved and changed over the past 2-3 years.
Sure. Well, I think if you looked at the cyber breach security offerings that were in the market 5 years ago, you'd see insurance carriers who were just asking you questions like, how much do you want, as measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that funding would just sort of generally be used for things like paying for customers' identity theft protection several years after their personal information was breached, or doing some of the things we talked about, like PR recovery or data recovery, legal costs, all of those things. I think now what you've seen is that from a risk management perspective, insurance offerings have matured to the point where they now understand that if they're going to offer you coverage, you also need to agree to do certain things. And as part of that underwriting process, they're going to be asking, what are you doing to, let's say, encrypt your data, or do business over a VPN connection, or how robust are your data backups? Because the insurance companies realize you can have a great policy, but when the statistics are that your average small business that has to close as the result of some sort of interruption of business for more than a week doesn't reopen.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that you can't really insure against as easily. And so they want to make sure that your business continuity and your disaster recovery is just as integrated into your risk management mindset as cybersecurity and theft of data.
So another question we got, it goes to the cost aspect again, but are there any sources of funding to help with cybersecurity?
Well, I think that on some level, there are sources of funding that can help with that. I would come at that two different ways. From a funding perspective, I would honestly say that organizations like the Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center are always out there looking for potential funding sources, whether it's an SBIR contract from the government to develop a new and effective way to protect your data, or whether it is just some sort of general grant that's available. Sometimes upstream contractors or customers of yours will sometimes have some sort of fund or way to defray the costs of compliance. If you fall into certain categories, like maybe you're a critical supplier for a specific part, you might have a little more leverage to get some funding for that. I would also say that this is probably one of the situations where I can categorically say that the government has actually done a lot here to provide a lot of free resources. That's not always something you can say about every branch of the government, but in this case, the Department of Homeland Security and NIST, with the National Institute for Standards and Technology, even the DoD has been working really hard to create a lot of available resources and tools that, whether it's training for your employees through the Department of Homeland Security's Stop, Think, Connect program they do every year for their Cyber Awareness Week, or just some of the NIST white papers that have been written on how to develop and build a secure system that you can just grab and read today. I mean, those are some of the ways that you can really cut down on the costs of learning and acquisition of new technology, or even maybe not even having to come to an organization like ours as your first step, and having a much more informed conversation. I think that can be really helpful.
What's the one thing that that surprises you that people don't do? I mean, is there one kind of like, this is so simple, every company should do it, but a lot of companies don't?
Well, I think that, and this is a little bit of an abstract, but I think that the biggest thing that constantly astounds me is that manufacturers aren't willing to put value on their own information and data. They just don't feel that what they have is really worth protecting. And I think that that's due to the fact that a lot of manufacturers, especially those who have been around for a while, it's kind of like a frog boiling in water. You don't notice the change. But over the decades, your organization has really developed a lot of unique business practices and effective procedures that make you competitive in the market, and wanting to protect those. I go from one organization to another and I see a new and unique thing that they do, and I'm just amazed that they haven't realized what they have inside their organization and that it needs to be protected and valued.
Again, it's not just the IP of the product or its design, it's the IP of all their processes. All the,
absolutely.
That represent the real barriers to entry.
There's a reason that not just anyone can just start a business tomorrow and compete with you.
Right.
There's got to be a reason for that, whether it's the relationships, the technologies, the procedures, whatever those may be. On a technical side, I think some of the things that I would really wish more organizations would do would definitely be some of the hallmark aspects of cybersecurity. So like finding a way to encrypt your data and your data backups is huge. A lost laptop can compromise millions of dollars in business. So not having those encrypted. Same thing with mobile phones. It's a huge threat. Things like multi-factor authentication, which if you're not familiar is, you put in your username and password, and then a secondary system will confirm the login, whether that's a push notification on your phone or a little keychain you've got, or a USB key.
A dongle.
A dongle. That dongle will save your bacon. I mean, it really cuts down to, I don't want to say near zero, but it completely eliminates from a lot of vectors the ability for someone to use a stolen password to compromise your systems. So those are huge.
So the last question that we always ask people is, what keeps you up at night? I'm not even sure I want to know what keeps you up at night, because you're dealing with some pretty murky stuff here.
To be completely honest, what really keeps me up at night are the friends, family members, community members, people I've known for a lot of years who work in manufacturing, and I'm just concerned that they aren't going to have jobs, not because the economy changed, because of shifting markets, but because of the shift of intellectual property outside of the normal fences where those are kept. Mm-hmm. So whether it's to another competitive group or to another nation state or to a different global presence, or increasing regulations making it untenable for their employer to continue to function as a manufacturer in a regulated space or industry. And that's really what keeps me up. I mean, here in Michigan, we do a lot of work in regulated spaces, and increasingly more so. There's a lot of influx of aerospace manufacturing coming here. There's a lot of more military contracts coming here. But, we're not doing missile defense here. We're not doing submarines here. We're not doing some of the really highly secured but high dollar industries. We tend to do much smaller dollar amount defense contracting here in Michigan with a lot more people involved. Mm-hmm. And it's those people that I really want to make sure have jobs going forward. So the thing that keeps me up at night is finding a way for specifically Michigan manufacturers to be more competitive than manufacturers in other states and other nation states.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. This is really good stuff. I could talk for quite a while longer, but we wanted to try and wrap up in 55 minutes. So just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be sending it out with the link. Also, the Right Place has a 4-step cybersecurity plan, a PDF that we'll send a link to. Deals with NIST issues, I guess. And any feedback after you watch this is welcome. We'll look to do more webinars on manufacturing-related topics and perhaps cybersecurity and other aspects of it as well. So thank you for taking the time to watch this. Thank you to the Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center, MMTC West, for partnering with us on this webinar. They're really kind of a hidden gem in the region for small and middle market manufacturing companies. They provide great technical support to manufacturers, again, a focus on the small and middle market companies to help them develop their business leaders' effectiveness, to drive product innovation, to promote operational excellence, and to help secure themselves and improve their profitability and cash flow. So the thing with MMTC West is that every project starts with a no-cost assessment. And once they figure out what a company needs, they hook them up with experts like your firm. So I would encourage you to check out their website, which is www.mmtcwest.org. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks for taking the time to watch.
Thanks, everybody.